Welcome, friend. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we'll leave the noise of the day behind and wander into a place where time moves a little slower. A place filled with quiet people, gentle stories, and peaceful journeys. So take a slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. And together, let's turn the page of the Deckle edge and discover where tonight's story begins. Rain had been falling over the village since dusk. It gathered along the crooked rooftops, slipped quietly through the gutters, and turned the narrow cobblestone streets to ribbons of reflected light. Behind drawn curtains, fires burned low, evening conversations softened, and one by one, the windows went dark. All except one. At the end of a small lane stood a narrow clockmaker's shop, its weathered sign moving gently in the wind. A warm amber glow shone through the front window, illuminating rows of pocket watches, brass pendulums, and the patient faces of clocks awaiting repair. Inside, the rain seemed very far away. The workshop was filled with the soft, uneven ticking of 100 small mechanisms. Some hurried, some hesitated, others marked each second with the solemn confidence of church bells. And seated beneath the light of a green-shaded lamp was Matthias Alder. His silver head was bent over the open case of a watch, his weathered hands guiding a pair of fine tweezers between gears no larger than grains of sand. Above him, the clocks continued their endless conversation. All but one. It rested beneath a cloth at the far end of his workbench, unfinished, unwound, and silent for nearly 27 years. Every clock in the workshop carried time faithfully forward. Every clock except one. Matthias Alder had spent most of his life measuring time in pieces small enough to hold between his fingers, springs thin as eyelashes, screws scarcely larger than grains of salt, brass wheels whose tiny teeth had to meet with perfect precision. He understood the quiet logic of such things. A clock did not conceal what troubled it. If it ran too quickly, there was a reason. If its hands refused to move, something inside had slipped, worn away, or fallen out of place. Given enough patience, the fault could always be found. People were more difficult. People carried their broken pieces where no lamplight could reach them. At 71, Matthias still opened the shop each morning at 8, just as his father had done before him. He raised the shade in the front window, turned the painted sign from closed to open, and wound the clocks in the same order he had followed for nearly half a century. First, the tall walnut regulator beside the door, then the 2 carriage clocks in the glass cabinet, then the painted cuckoo clock, whose small wooden bird had long ago lost most of its red feathers. One after another, Matthias gave each mechanism what it needed. A turn of a key, a drop of oil, the light pressure of one careful finger. By 9, the workshop would be ticking around him. The sounds overlapped without ever quite agreeing. 100 separate seconds, advancing at nearly but never exactly the same pace. Visitors sometimes found the noise distracting. Matthias did not. To him, it was the sound of things continuing. The villagers brought him clocks that had belonged to parents, grandparents, and people whose names were no longer spoken often. They arrived carrying them carefully in boxes or wrapped in old blankets, apologizing for dust that Matthias did not mind. He repaired each one as though its return mattered, because it did. A clock was seldom only a clock by the time it reached his workbench. It was a wedding gift, a childhood morning, a familiar chime once heard from another room. The owners rarely said so directly, but Matthias understood. They were not asking him to repair wood and metal. They were asking whether some small part of the past might still be persuaded to move. Most evenings he worked long after the shop had closed. At 7:30, he heated water on the small iron stove in the back room. He placed tea leaves in a blue ceramic pot and carried it to the workbench with 2 cups. He had been setting out the second cup for so many years that he no longer noticed himself doing it. It remained across from him, untouched, while he ate a simple supper and listened to the rain. Years earlier, Clara had occupied that chair. As a child, she had spent hours beneath the workbench, gathering fallen screws in a little wooden bowl. When she grew tall enough to see the surface, Matthias taught her the names of his tools: tweezers, brooch, mainspring winder. She remembered every one. By 12, she could dismantle a pocket watch without losing a single piece. By 16, she had begun sketching mechanisms of her own in the margins of school books. Her drawings unsettled Matthias, not because they were foolish, but because they were good. Clara imagined clocks unlike any he had repaired, clocks that followed the moon, clocks that marked the changing seasons. One design used 2 pendulums swinging in opposite directions, balanced so delicately that the motion of one sustained the other. Matthias had told her it would never work. Clara built it anyway. For 6 months, the 2 of them worked on the clock together after the shop closed. Clara designed its movement, and Matthias helped her shape the brass components by hand. Its case was made from dark alder wood, polished until the grain looked almost like ripples on water. Its face was pale ivory, with slender black hands, and no numbers except 12. Clara had left the remaining hours unmarked. The other numbers make it look too certain, she had explained. Matthias had frowned at that. Time, in his experience, was supposed to be certain. The clock was nearly complete when Clara received a letter from the city. She had been accepted into a school of mechanical design. She read the letter aloud beside the workbench, hardly able to keep the happiness from her voice. There would be engines to study, machines larger than rooms, and teachers who built things Matthias had only seen in books. She wanted him to be pleased. Some part of him was, but pride arrived carrying fear beside it, and Matthias had never learned how to separate the 2. He imagined the empty chair, the silent rooms above the shop, the family workshop passing one day into unfamiliar hands. Most of all, he imagined Clara discovering that the world beyond the village offered more than he ever could. So instead of telling her that her talent deserved a larger place, he asked who would finish the work she had begun. Instead of saying he would miss her, he said the city was full of people who made promises they did not keep. And instead of telling his daughter that he was proud of her, Matthias returned to the watch beneath his lamp and said nothing at all. Clara left on a rainy evening 3 days later. The unfinished clock remained on the far end of the bench. Matthias told himself he would complete it once his anger had passed. Then he told himself he would finish it when Clara returned. After a year, he covered it with a cloth to keep away the dust. After 5, he stopped looking in its direction. 27 years passed. Now, on another rain-soaked evening, Matthias finished repairing the watch beneath his lamp and placed it carefully in its velvet-lined case. The shop had grown cold. He rubbed his hands together, reached for his tea, and found that the cup had been empty for some time. Across from him, the second cup remained full. Matthias looked at it for a long while. Then, somewhere beneath the layered ticking of the workshop, he heard a small, metallic sound. A single, delicate click. He lifted his head. Nothing appeared to have changed. The pendulums continued swinging. The carriage clocks continued their measured tapping. Rain whispered against the window. Then the sound came again. Click. It had come from the far end of the workbench. Matthias slowly rose from his chair. The cloth covering Clara's clock had faded from black to grey. Dust softened its folds, except near the bottom, where one corner now seemed slightly disturbed. He stood before it without touching it. For 27 years, the clock had remained unfinished. It had no wound mainspring. Its escapement had never been properly set. There was no reason for anything inside it to move. Still, Matthias reached for the cloth. A pale cloud of dust rose as he drew it away. The alderwood case appeared beneath, dark and smooth despite the years. The ivory face remained empty, except for the number 12 and the 2 slender hands resting beneath it. Both pointed upward. Midnight. Matthias leaned closer. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, through the small glass window beneath the face, one brass wheel shifted forward. It moved by the width of a single tooth. Click. Matthias did not breathe. From somewhere deep inside the unfinished clock came the faint sound of a spring drawing tight. And for the first time in 27 years, its minute hand began to move. The minute hand moved slowly away from 12. Matthias watched it pass the first narrow mark on the ivory face, then the second. There was no key in the clock, no weight pulling beneath it, no wound spring capable of driving the movement forward. Yet somewhere within the alderwood case, wheels that had remained still for 27 years were beginning to turn. One after another, their brass teeth found each other. Click, click, click. The sound was faint, but Matthias heard it clearly beneath the 100 clocks surrounding him. He reached for the small latch at the back of the case. Before his fingers touched it, every clock in the workshop stopped. The silence arrived all at once. Pendulums froze midway through their arcs. The cuckoo bird remained hidden behind its little painted door. The tall walnut regulator beside the entrance held its breath between 1 second and the next. Even the rain seemed to disappear. Matthias stood motionless. For nearly 50 years he had known the workshop by its ticking. Without it, the room felt larger, emptier. Then the unfinished clock gave a single, resonant chime. The sound was far deeper than its slender case should have allowed. It passed through the workbench and climbed the walls, trembling through glass cabinets and metal tools. The green-shaded lamp above Matthias flickered, once, twice, then went dark. For a moment, the workshop was illuminated only by the amber streetlight beyond the rain-streaked window. Matthias reached for the matches beside the stove, but before he found them, the room began to change. The cold faded first. Warmth gathered around his hands and face, carrying the scent of burning cedar from the iron stove. The empty teacup across from him was no longer empty. Steam rose from it in a thin white ribbon. The dust vanished from the shelves. Tarnished tools brightened. A faded calendar near the back room returned to a deep, unworn blue. Matthias stared at the date printed upon it. October 17th, 27 years earlier. A chair scraped against the wooden floor behind him. Matthias turned. Clara stood at the opposite end of the workbench. She was 22 again. Her dark auburn hair had been gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, though several strands had escaped and curled beside her cheeks. She wore the brown wool coat she had saved for months to buy, and held a small leather case in one hand. Rain darkened its shoulders. For a few seconds, Matthias could not understand what he was seeing. He knew this moment, not because he remembered every word that had been spoken, but because he had spent 27 years trying not to remember them. Clara's final evening in the workshop, the night she left. Matthias whispered her name. Clara. She gave no sign that she had heard him. Her hazel eyes were fixed on someone beside the workbench. Matthias followed her gaze. There, seated beneath the green-shaded lamp, was another version of himself. His hair was still dark. His beard carried only a little grey. His shoulders were broader, and his hands moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who believed there would always be more time. The younger Matthias continued fitting the back onto a silver pocket watch. He did not look up. Clara waited. The older Matthias remembered that silence. He remembered filling it deliberately, letting each second harden between them, because he had not known how to surrender his anger without also surrendering his pride. You could still come to the station, Clara said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, and not as he remembered it at all. Time had softened its edges in his mind. He had convinced himself that she had sounded distant that night, certain, already gone. But the young woman standing before him did not sound certain. She sounded hopeful. The younger Matthias placed the cover on the watch and pressed it closed. "You know the way," he replied. The words were quiet. They were also crueler than Matthias remembered. Clara lowered her eyes. "I thought you might want to see the train." "I've seen trains before." "That isn't what I meant." The older Matthias stepped toward her. He wanted to tell her that he knew what she meant now. He wanted to place his hands upon her shoulders and explain all the things the man beneath the lamp had been too frightened to say. But the unfinished clock chimed softly behind him. Matthias turned toward its ivory face. Its minute hand had advanced. 11 seconds had passed. He looked back at Clara. She had moved toward the workbench where the unfinished clock stood uncovered and incomplete. For the first time, Matthias noticed that its alder wood case had not yet been polished. Pencil marks remained along its edges. A scattering of tiny brass pieces waited beside it in a shallow tray. Clara rested her fingertips against the wood. "I could finish it when I visit," she said. The younger Matthias said nothing. "I will visit." Still, he did not look at her. Clara drew a slow breath. "Unless you would rather I didn't." The older Matthias felt something inside him tighten. He remembered her departure as an announcement. He remembered defiance in her voice and impatience in the way she had stood by the door. But that was not what he saw now. Clara had not been asking whether she should leave. She had been asking whether she could return. "Tell her," Matthias whispered. His younger self reached for another watch. "Tell her she can come home." The man beneath the lamp did not answer. Matthias stepped between them. "Look at her." Neither seemed able to see him. "Matthias," Clara said. Her father's name sounded unfamiliar in her voice. She had always called him Papa. The unfinished clock continued counting. 31 seconds. 32. 33. The older Matthias reached across the workbench and placed his hand over the watch his younger self was holding. His fingers passed through it like a reflection disturbed upon water. The image trembled. For an instant, the workshop became transparent. Matthias saw the dusty shelves of the present beneath the warm room of the past. 2 evenings occupied the same space, separated by 27 years and something thinner than glass. Then the memory settled again. Clara picked up her leather case. "I should go." The younger Matthias gave a small nod. It was the only farewell he offered her. Clara waited a moment longer. Her hand tightened around the handle of the case. There were tears in her eyes, though she turned away before her father could have seen them. The older Matthias saw. He had never remembered the tears. "Clara!" This time he shouted her name. She walked toward the door. Matthias followed, but the air around him seemed to grow heavy. Each step required more effort than the last, as though time itself were thickening between them. The unfinished clock marked 50 seconds. Clara reached the entrance. Her fingers closed around the brass handle. "Please," Matthias said. 53. She opened the door, and the sound of rain filled the workshop. 55. Cold air swept inside, lifting the loose strands of her hair. 57. Clara stepped into the night. Matthias reached the doorway just as she began to turn. Then the minute ended. The workshop vanished into darkness. The warmth left the room. The cedar scent faded. The blue calendar curled back into its faded present-day shape. All around Matthias, the clocks resumed their ticking. He stood alone beside the closed door. His outstretched hand rested against its weathered wood. Behind him, the unfinished clock was silent once more. Matthias remained where he was for a long while. He could still hear Clara's voice. "Unless you would rather I didn't." For 27 years, Matthias had believed that his daughter left without looking back. But in the final instant before the workshop disappeared, Clara had begun to turn toward him, and he had not seen what happened next. Matthias did not sleep. He carried Clara's clock to the center of the workbench and placed it beneath the green-shaded lamp. Then he removed its wooden back and examined the mechanism within. The movement was exactly as he remembered it. Incomplete. Several teeth had never been cut into the second wheel. The balance spring remained unattached. One of the twin pendulums Clara had designed was still missing its final brass weight. Nothing inside the case could have produced the movement he had witnessed. And yet, when Matthias turned the clock toward him, its hands no longer rested together beneath the number 12. The minute hand had stopped one mark beyond it. 12:01. He touched the glass with the tip of one finger. The clock had not merely shown him a minute from the past, it had kept it. All through the night, Matthias tried to make the mechanism move again. He adjusted the spring, he tested the wheels, he searched the shallow drawers beneath the bench for Clara's original sketches. Near dawn, he found them tied with a faded green ribbon. The pages smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. Clara's handwriting moved across them in quick, sloping lines, filling the margins with calculations, questions, and improvements she had intended to make. Matthias sat slowly in his chair. He remembered telling her that the opposing pendulums would interfere with one another. He had expected their movements to weaken the clock until both came to rest. But Clara's final drawing showed something he had overlooked. Each pendulum was not meant to resist the other. It was meant to return the motion it received. When one began to slow, the second would carry it forward. Matthias studied the drawing until morning light appeared at the window. Her design might have worked. Perhaps it always could have. At 8, he did not turn the sign to open. For the first time since a winter fever had confined him upstairs 11 years earlier, Matthias Alder kept the clockmaker's shop closed. He remained at the bench with Clara's sketches spread before him, and the unfinished clock standing silently among them. Several times he considered completing it. The missing brass weight would take less than an hour to shape. The balance spring could be attached in minutes. He could cut the unfinished teeth and polish the pivots before noon. His tools were already arranged beside his hand. But each time he reached for them, he stopped. Matthias had repaired thousands of clocks by discovering what prevented them from moving forward. This one had moved because it was unfinished. Completing it might silence it forever. So he waited. The rain continued throughout the day. Water traced wavering paths down the front window, blurring the village beyond. Now and then, someone tried the locked door or peered inside, but Matthias remained in the back of the workshop where they could not see him. He thought about Clara. Not the young woman in the brown coat, but the daughter who was now 49 years old. For a long while after she left, letters had arrived from the city. The first described her narrow room above a bakery and the bells that woke her before sunrise. The next told him about her classes, the engines she had seen, and a professor who believed her clock designs deserved to be built. She always ended them the same way. "I hope the shop is well. I hope you are well too." Matthias had answered each letter, though never as fully as he intended. "The shop is well. I am keeping busy. Take care in the city." He wrote about the weather. He wrote about repairs. He told her when the grocer married and when the old chestnut tree in the square was struck by lightning. He never wrote that he missed her. As the years passed, Clara's letters came less often. She moved twice. Then a final envelope was returned to Matthias with no forwarding address. He could have asked after her. He could have written to her school or taken the morning train into the city. Instead, he placed the returned letter in a drawer and told himself Clara would contact him when she wished to be found. It was easier to call his silence patience. Now Matthias looked toward that drawer. Behind its small brass handle waited the last words he had tried to send his daughter, still sealed after 19 years. He did not open it. Not yet. The clocks marked noon, then 3, then 6. At 7:30, Matthias heated water and carried the blue teapot to the workbench. As always, he brought 2 cups. This time, when he noticed the second one, he did not leave it untouched. He poured it out, washed it carefully, and returned it to the shelf. The empty chair remained across from him. But for the first time in many years, Matthias allowed himself to understand that no habit could place Clara there. If he wanted his daughter to return, he would have to do more than continue waiting. Outside, the village settled into darkness. Matthias moved Clara's clock to the far end of the bench, where it had stood on the night she left. He opened the shop door and tested how quickly he could reach the street. Then he left it slightly ajar. At 11:59, the workshop was warm, silent except for its many clocks, and bright beneath the green-shaded lamp. Matthias stood beside the entrance with his hand upon the brass handle. This time, he would be ready. The tall regulator began its final minute before midnight. Matthias counted each swing of its pendulum. 58, 59, 60. The unfinished clock gave its deep, impossible chime. Every other clock stopped. The lamp went dark. Warmth moved through the workshop, and the scent of cedar returned. Dust withdrew from the shelves. The faded calendar became blue once more. But Clara was no longer standing beside the workbench. The younger Matthias sat alone beneath the lamp, staring at the watch in his hands without repairing it. The door was open. Rain blew across the threshold. The unfinished clock's hands stood at 12:01. Then the minute hand began to move. Matthias pulled open the door and stepped outside. The lane had become the lane of 27 years earlier. Paint returned to the neighbouring shutters. The old bakery sign hung above a doorway that now belonged to a tailor. Gas lamps burned where electric ones had since been installed. And beneath them, walking quickly through the rain, was Clara. Her leather case swung at her side. Her free hand was raised to shield her face, though the rain had already darkened her hair and coat. "Clara!" Matthias followed. As before, she did not hear him, but he was no longer fighting the thickened air of the closing seconds. He moved easily through the memory, passing the shop window as the clock counted behind him. Clara reached the corner of the lane. Then she stopped. Matthias stopped as well. The station lay downhill to the left. Its lamps were visible through the rain, and beyond the rooftops came the distant hiss of the waiting engine. Clara could have reached it in 5 minutes. Instead, she turned around. She looked back toward the Clockmaker's shop. Matthias had remembered anger in her face. He had carried that imagined expression for 27 years, using it to defend the silence that followed. But Clara was not angry. She was waiting. Rain gathered on her eyelashes. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the leather case as she watched the lighted doorway. 10 seconds passed, then 20. She did not move. Matthias stood only a few feet away. He saw hope slowly give way to understanding. She had left the door open long enough for him to follow. She had paused at the corner. She had given him every chance she knew how to give. "Go to her," Matthias whispered. Through the workshop window, he could see his younger self seated at the bench. The man had not moved. "Please." Matthias crossed the lane and stood before Clara. He knew she could neither see nor hear him, but there were words he could no longer keep inside. "I was proud of you." Clara continued watching the shop. "I was proud from the moment I saw your drawings. I knew you could build things I did not understand." His voice trembled. "And I was afraid that once you learned how much larger the world was, there would be no reason to come back." The station whistle sounded in the distance. Clara lowered her eyes. 45 seconds. Matthias wanted to reach for her hand, though he knew his fingers would pass through hers. "I should have gone to the station," he said. "I should have told you that leaving was not the same as abandoning me." Clara turned toward the hill. The minute was nearly gone. She took one step, then paused again. Without looking back, she spoke so softly that the rain almost carried the words away. "Goodbye, Papa." Matthias closed his eyes. Behind him, the unfinished clock completed its second minute. The rain disappeared. When Matthias opened his eyes, the old bakery was gone. Electric lamps shone along the lane, and the neighbouring shutters were faded once more. He stood alone at the corner. For the first time, he understood the full shape of the night Clara left. His daughter had looked back. She had waited, and when he did not come, she had still called him Papa. Matthias returned slowly to the workshop. The clocks were ticking again. Clara's clock stood silent upon the bench, its minute hand now resting 2 marks beyond 12. 12:02. Matthias sat beneath the lamp and unfolded her sketches. He no longer wondered whether the clock would run again the following night. He knew it would. Each midnight would return the next minute to him. Perhaps the walk to the station. Perhaps the platform. Perhaps Clara seated alone inside the train. Matthias remained at the workbench until morning. Clara's sketches lay open beneath the green-shaded lamp. Beside them rested the clockmaker's key, a narrow steel instrument made for turning hands without disturbing the movement beneath them. He had used it thousands of times. A clock arrived showing the wrong hour, and Matthias corrected it. He guided its hands forward or backward until the face agreed with the world again. But Clara's clock did not measure the world as it was. It measured a single night that had ended 27 years ago. Its hands now rested at 12:02. Matthias inserted the key into the small opening at the centre of the ivory face. He applied the lightest pressure. The minute hand resisted. He pressed a little harder. From inside the case came a faint vibration, like a warning carried through metal. Matthias released the key. The hand remained where it was. He removed the wooden back and studied the opposing pendulums. One was complete. The other ended in an empty fitting where its final brass weight should have been. Clara's drawings showed how the two were meant to work. Motion given, motion returned. Matthias looked again at the unfinished half of the mechanism. Perhaps that was why the past could not hear him. The clock was carrying movement in only one direction, from Clara's night to his own. With the second pendulum completed, something might pass the other way. A voice, a touch, one sentence delivered across 27 years. He knew it was an impossible conclusion, but impossibility had already chimed twice at midnight. Matthias selected a piece of brass from the cabinet and began to work. He measured the missing weight from Clara's drawing, cut its rough shape, and filed its edges until it balanced perfectly upon the tip of his finger. He polished it until the lamplight shone across its surface. Attaching it would require only one small screw. Matthias held the weight above the unfinished pendulum. Then he remembered Clara's hand resting against the older wood case. I could finish it when I visit. The clock had been hers to complete. Even now, Matthias was preparing to do what he had always done. Take something Clara had imagined and decide for himself what it was meant to become. He lowered the brass weight. For several minutes he sat without moving. Then his attention returned to the sketches. Near the bottom of the final page, beneath calculations he had already read many times, Clara had written a single line in smaller letters. A clock cannot return what has passed. It can only remind us to notice what remains. Matthias traced the words with one finger. He wondered when she had written them. Perhaps while he was busy correcting one of her measurements. Perhaps during an evening when she had tried to explain the clock and he had listened only for errors. Outside, morning entered the village. Doors opened. Carts moved along the wet streets. Someone knocked at the shop, waited, and went away. Matthias kept the sign turned to closed. He read Clara's sentence again. The unfinished clock had returned 2 minutes of the past. But Clara had designed it long before that night. She could not have known what it would someday show him. Perhaps the words had meant nothing more than what they said. Time passed. People remained. And while they remained, there was still something one could do. Matthias looked toward the old returned letter beside the workbench. Somewhere beyond the village, Clara was 49 years old. She might have a home of her own, a family, a workshop filled with machines he would not recognize. She might have abandoned mechanical design entirely. She might no longer wish to hear from him. Matthias knew none of these things because he had spent 19 years treating uncertainty as an answer. That afternoon, he walked to the railway office beneath a grey umbrella. The station master was too young to remember Clara, but he allowed Matthias to use the telephone in the back room. Matthias called the School of Mechanical Design and waited while his request passed from one office to another. At last, an archivist found Clara's name. She had graduated 23 years earlier with honours. For a moment, Matthias could not speak. The archivist also found the name of the engineering firm where Clara had first been employed. The firm had since closed, but its records might have been transferred to the City Guild. Matthias wrote down every detail. It was not an address. It was not yet a path to his daughter. But it was more than he had known that morning. When he returned to the shop, evening had begun to gather. Clara's clock waited beneath the lamp. The polished brass weight remained beside it, unattached. Matthias placed the new information in the drawer with the returned letter. Then he prepared the workshop for midnight. He did not know whether completing the second pendulum would allow Clara to hear him. He only knew that if he left it unfinished, he would always wonder whether one final chance had been within his reach. At 11:59, Matthias lifted the brass weight again. The screw entered easily. With one careful turn, the second pendulum was complete. Matthias closed the case. Then he stood before the clock and waited. At midnight, the unfinished clock chimed. The other clocks fell silent. The lamp went dark, and the workshop filled with the warmth of burning cedar. But this time, the memory did not settle gently around Matthias. The walls flickered between past and present. Dust appeared and vanished upon the shelves. The open doorway showed the old gaslit lane, then the empty modern street, and the old lane once more. The two completed pendulums moved behind the glass. One swung forward, the other returned. For the first time, Matthias felt the clock respond to him. The steel key remained in his hand. He placed it against the centre of the ivory face and turned. The minute hand trembled, then moved backward. 12:01. The lane outside shifted. Clara stood at the corner again, looking toward the workshop through the rain. Matthias opened the door and ran to her. "Clara!" Her expression changed, only slightly, but she had heard something. Matthias stopped before her. "Clara, can you hear me?" Her eyes searched the rain-darkened lane. "Papa?" The word was uncertain, almost lost beneath the weather. Joy and grief rose together inside Matthias so quickly that he could hardly breathe. "Yes," he said, "it is me." Clara looked toward the shop. She could not see the old man standing before her. She saw only the doorway and the father who had failed to phono. But somehow his voice had reached her. "I am proud of you," Matthias said. The clock vibrated behind him. The gas lamps flared. The rain began falling upward from the cobblestones, each drop returning toward the clouds. Clara's image wavered. Matthias continued. "I should have told you that night. I should have gone to the station. I should have..." The lane shifted beneath his feet. Clara was suddenly farther away, then near again. Her hand opened and closed around the leather case. "Papa?" Fear entered her voice. The same moment was beginning to repeat. Clara turned toward the station, stopped, and looked back at the shop. Then she turned toward the station again. Each movement came more quickly than the one before it. Matthias looked through the open doorway. The pendulums were swinging violently. Tools rattled across the workbench. A thin crack had appeared at the edge of the clock's ivory face. He had forced the two directions of time against one another. The clock was not carrying his words into the past. It was holding Clara inside it. "Stop," Matthias whispered. But the pendulums accelerated. Clara looked back again, and again. Each time, the hope in her expression faded. Each time, she waited for a father who did not come. Matthias had wanted another opportunity to change that night. Instead, he was asking his daughter to endure it over and over so that he might feel forgiven. He turned away from her and ran toward the workshop. The distance stretched before him. The lane lengthened with every step, placing the doorway farther away. Matthias lowered his head and continued. Behind him, Clara called for her father. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to answer. But the Clara in the rain could not be rescued. She was a moment the clock had remembered, not the daughter who had lived through all the years after it. Matthias reached the workshop. The crack had crossed the ivory face and was moving toward the number 12. He opened the rear case. The pendulums blurred before him. The new brass weight shone at the end of the second. Matthias took hold of it. Pain struck through his fingers as the mechanism fought to continue. He tightened his grip, stopped the pendulum, and removed the small screw. The brass weight fell into his palm. At once, the clock released a deep and sorrowful chime. The memory broke. The rain fell normally for one final second. At the corner of the lane, Clara turned toward the station. This time, Matthias did not ask her to wait. "Go," he said softly. "Build everything I was afraid you could." Clara walked down the hill. The past disappeared. Matthias stood in the present-day workshop with one hand braced against the bench. The clocks resumed their ticking. Behind the cracked face of Clara's clock, the minute hand rested at 12:03. The second pendulum hung incomplete once more. Matthias opened his hand and looked at the brass weight. He could attach it again the following night. Perhaps he could find a gentler way to speak through the clock. Perhaps, with enough study, he could return to an earlier minute and persuade his younger self to open the door. But even if he succeeded, the years that followed would not vanish. Nor should they. They belonged to Clara. Her triumphs, her disappointments, the person she had become without him. Matthias placed the brass weight beside her sketches, and he removed the steel key from the clock's face. For most of his life, he had believed repair meant restoring something to what it had been before it broke. Now he understood that some things could not, and should not, be returned to their former shape. They could only be acknowledged, and then carried differently. Matthias took a clean sheet of paper from the drawer. For a while he listened to the clocks and watched rain gather upon the window. He did not know where to send the letter. He did not know whether Clara would read it if he found her. But he knew what it needed to say. He dipped his pen into the ink. "My dear Clara." He stopped. The old Matthias would have begun with news of the shop or an apology for the unexpected letter. He would have approached the truth slowly, hiding it among ordinary things. This time, he did not. "I was proud of you. I was always proud of you. I should have said it when you were here to hear me." Matthias continued writing. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not explain his silence as though fear excused it. He told her the truth about the empty chair, the unanswered letters, and the rainy night he had remembered incorrectly for 27 years. When he reached the bottom of the page, the sky beyond the workshop had begun to lighten. He signed his name, Papa. Then Matthias folded the letter and placed it beside Clara's unfinished clock. The past had heard enough from him. Now he would find his daughter and speak to the woman she had become. By sunrise, Matthias had written Clara's name upon 3 envelopes. The first held the letter. The second contained a request to the City Guild for any address they were permitted to provide. The third was addressed to the engineering firm where Clara had once worked, though he knew the building had closed years before. He carried all 3 to the railway office as soon as it opened. The station master listened while Matthias explained what he needed, then he disappeared into the back room and returned with a ledger beneath one arm. "The guild telephoned," he said. "Someone there remembered the name." Matthias gripped the edge of the counter. Clara Alder had remained with the firm until its closure. Afterward, she had joined a smaller workshop on the northern side of the city. The workshop was called Alder and Vale Mechanical Works. Matthias read the name twice. Alder. Clara had kept it. The station master copied the address onto a square of paper. "There is a train at 9:10. Matthias looked toward the platform. For 27 years, the city had been less than 2 hours away. He had made it distant by never going. "I will take it," he said. Matthias returned briefly to the clockmaker's shop. He washed the ink from his fingers, changed his shirt, and put on the charcoal coat reserved for funerals and winter Sundays. Clara's letter went into the inside pocket, close to his chest. Before leaving, he stopped beside her clock. The crack remained across its ivory face. Its minute hand rested at 12:03, and the second pendulum hung unfinished behind the glass. Matthias placed the brass weight and Clara's sketches in a wooden box. Then he carried them with him. The morning train arrived beneath a low, grey sky. Matthias chose a seat beside the window. As the village disappeared, he watched fields pass in long bands of brown and green. He tried to imagine Clara's life in the city. Perhaps she had married. Perhaps the name Alder belonged only to the workshop and not to her. Perhaps she had children who knew nothing of the grandfather who repaired clocks in a distant village. He rehearsed what he would say. Each version sounded like an argument for why she should forgive him. So Matthias abandoned them all. The city had grown since his last visit. Brick buildings stood where open lots had once bordered the railway. Electric wires crossed above crowded streets. Motorcars moved among bicycles and delivery wagons. He asked for directions twice before finding the northern district. Alder and Vale Mechanical Works occupied the ground floor of an old textile building beside the river. Its windows were tall and bright. Through them, Matthias saw drafting tables, shelves of gears, and machines larger than anything in his own workshop. Above the entrance hung a modest painted sign. Alder and Vale, Precision Mechanisms and Instruments. Matthias stopped across the street. Clara had built the kind of place she once tried to describe to him. For a moment, pride filled him so completely that it hurt. Then the door opened, and a young man in a leather apron carried a crate toward a waiting cart. Matthias crossed the street before fear could persuade him to wait again. Inside, the air smelled of warm metal, oil, and freshly cut wood. A woman at the front desk looked up from a stack of invoices. "May I help you?" Matthias removed his hat. "I am looking for Clara Alder. Do you have an appointment?" "No." The woman hesitated. "May I ask your name?" "Matthias Alder." Something changed in her expression. She seemed to recognize it. Without asking another question, she disappeared through a doorway at the rear of the room. Matthias stood alone beside a glass cabinet displaying the workshop's creations. There were navigation instruments, small engines, and mechanical models whose purposes he could not guess. On the highest shelf stood a clock. Its case was made from pale ash wood. Two pendulums swung behind a narrow window, moving in opposite directions. The face bore only one number: 12. Matthias stepped closer. Clara had built it. Not the unfinished clock from his shop, but another shaped by the same idea. Each pendulum received the motion of the other, their opposing movements holding the mechanism in balance. It worked exactly as she had believed it would. Footsteps sounded behind him. Matthias turned. Clara stood in the doorway. Her auburn hair was threaded with silver and gathered at the nape of her neck. Fine lines rested beside her eyes. Her pencil had been tucked behind one ear, and the sleeves of her white shirt were rolled above her elbows. There was grease upon one hand. Matthias recognized her immediately. But she was not the young woman the clock had held beneath the rain. She was 49 years old. She had lived 27 years he had never seen. Clara stopped when she saw the wooden box in his hands. Neither of them spoke. Matthias felt every sentence he had rehearsed disappear. At last, Clara looked toward his face. "Papa?" This time the word did not come from the past. Matthias lowered his head. "Yes." Clara remained in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" There was no anger in her voice. That would have been easier. There was caution. Matthias understood that caution had been earned. "I should have come a long time ago," he said. "I have no excuse for why I did not." Clara glanced toward the front desk, where the woman had quietly returned to her invoices. Then she looked at the box. "What is that?" "The clock we began." For the first time, Clara stepped closer. "You kept it?"
I kept everything. The answer sounded almost noble until Matthias heard it aloud. Keeping was not the same as caring for something. Waiting was not the same as reaching for someone. I brought your drawings too, he said. Clara placed her grease-marked hand upon the lid of the box, but did not open it. Matthias removed the letter from his coat. I wrote this for you. She looked at the envelope. I do not expect it to repair anything. Clara's eyes lifted to his. Then why did you come? Matthias held the letter between them. Because you should not have to come home before I tell you the truth. His hand trembled slightly. I was proud of you, Clara. I was afraid, and I allowed my fear to speak in place of my love. You asked me to follow you that night, and I did not. Clara said nothing. I cannot change what happened, Matthias continued, and I will not ask you to pretend it did not. He offered her the envelope. But I wanted to say it while you were still here to hear me. After a long moment, Clara accepted the letter. She looked at her name written in his careful hand. Then she opened the door beside her. My office is through here, she said. It was not forgiveness, but it was an invitation. And this time, Matthias followed.
Clara's office overlooked the river. Drawings covered one wall from floor to ceiling. Some showed delicate instruments no larger than pocket watches. Others depicted engines whose wheels would have filled Matthias's entire shop. Near the window stood a small table with 2 chairs. Clara placed the unopened letter upon it. Tea? She asked. Yes. She filled a kettle at the basin. Matthias sat with the wooden box upon his knees. He wanted to fill the silence with questions, but he knew how easily questions could become demands. Are you married? Do you have children? Why did you stop writing? Why did you never return? He had forfeited the right to ask for 27 years all at once. Clara placed a cup before him and sat across the table. For a while, neither drank. Then she looked toward the wooden box. May I see it? Matthias set the box between them. Clara lifted the lid. Her old sketches lay on top, still bound by the faded green ribbon. Beneath them rested the older wood clock, wrapped carefully in cloth. She drew it out. When she saw the crack across its ivory face, her brow tightened. What happened? I tried to make it do something it was not meant to do. A faint, sad smile appeared at the corner of Clara's mouth. You always did. Matthias accepted the words without defending himself. Yes. Clara turned the clock around and opened its wooden back. Her hands moved with the same confidence they had possessed at 16, though now there was no hesitation in them. She examined the gears, the unattached balance spring, and the incomplete second pendulum. Then she saw the polished brass weight. You made this? Last night. It is precisely measured. I used your drawing. Clara rolled the weight slowly between her fingers. You told me the design would never work. I was wrong. Her eyes moved toward the clock in a glass cabinet outside. I know. There was no triumph in her voice, only the weight of how long she had known it alone. Matthias looked down at his tea. I saw the one you built. The first successful model. How long did it take? 4 years. He thought of the unfinished clock hidden beneath its cloth. I wish I had seen it then. Clara returned the brass weight to the box.
You could have. I know. The river moved beyond the window, grey beneath the morning sky. Clara picked up the letter. You said you kept everything. Every letter. Why did you stop answering? I sent one after your final letter. It was returned. And after that? Matthias met her eyes. After that, I told myself you would write when you were ready. Clara's fingers tightened around the envelope. I thought the same about you. The two of them sat with that truth between them. Neither had known how to cross the silence, but Matthias had been the father. He should have crossed it first. I am sorry, he said. Clara looked toward the river. I waited for you at the corner that night. I know. She turned back sharply. Matthias rested one hand upon the clock. I remembered it differently for many years. I told myself you walked away without looking back. I looked back twice. Yes. How could you know that? Matthias considered telling her about the impossible chime, the stopped clocks, and the minutes returned at midnight. The story sounded fragile beneath the ordinary daylight. So he told her all of it. Clara listened without interruption. When he finished, she opened the rear of the clock again. Her fingertips moved across the gears and stopped beside the opposing pendulums. A clock cannot return what has passed, she murmured. It can only remind us to notice what remains. Clara looked at him. You read my note. Too late. But you read it. Clara lifted the polished weight. If I attach this, the clock may never show you another minute. I know. You may never see that night again. I have seen enough of it. Clara studied his face. Then she returned the clock to the box without completing it. Not today, she said. Matthias nodded. No, not today. She opened his letter. He watched her read the first line, then turned toward the window to give her what privacy the small office allowed. Several minutes passed. When Clara finished, she folded the page carefully along its original crease. I cannot give you an answer yet, she said. I did not come to ask for one. I am still angry. You should be. And I missed you. Matthias closed his eyes briefly. I missed you too. Clara wiped one tear from her cheek with the heel of her hand, leaving a faint trace of machine grease beneath her eye. When does your train leave? There is one at 6. She looked at the clock upon the wall. That gives us 4 hours. Matthias waited. Clara poured more tea into both cups. Then, slowly, she began to tell him about the years he had missed. She told him about the school, the bakery beneath her first room, and the professor who helped her build the opposing pendulum clock. She spoke of failed designs, long nights, and the partnership that became Alder and Vale. Matthias listened. He did not interrupt to correct a detail. He did not search her story for evidence that she had needed him. He simply listened. 4 hours could not contain 27 years, but they could hold a beginning. 3 months later, Clara returned to the village. She arrived on an autumn afternoon carrying the same wooden box Matthias had brought to the city. The clockmaker's shop was open. When the bell above the door rang, Matthias rose so quickly that his chair struck the wall behind him. Clara stood beneath the faded sign with rain upon her coat. This time, Matthias did not wait for her to cross the room alone. He went to meet her. They worked on the clock after the shop closed. Clara replaced the cracked ivory face. Matthias cut the missing teeth into the second wheel. Together they attached the balance spring and secured the brass weight to the opposing pendulum. Neither tried to return the hands to 12. They left them at 12:03. The final 27 years would remain part of the clock's history, just as they remained part of theirs. Near midnight, Clara closed the alder wood case. "Ready?" she asked. Matthias looked at his daughter. "Yes." Clara set both pendulums in motion. One swung forward, the other returned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mechanism found its rhythm. The minute hand moved beyond 12:03. It did not chime. The workshop did not darken. No vanished evening gathered around them. The clock simply moved forward. Clara watched it pass the next narrow mark. Matthias went to the shelf and brought down the blue teapot. He placed one cup before Clara. Then he filled the second for himself. Outside, rain whispered against the window. Inside, 100 clocks measured the quiet passage of the hour. And among them, at last, Clara's clock was ticking too. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope this story brought you a little peace, a little hope, and a moment of quiet before sleep. If you'd like to return for another journey, I'd love to have you back. Until next time, sleep well. May your dreams be full of wonder.